This presentation is delivered by the Stanford Center for Professional Development.
Okay, so today we're jumping around different order of topics, but this is maybe, I think, the next topic that some people are working on. It's obviously too late to for them, but at least people have, for their projects, but we can at least cover the material, and for people who are doing this, at least it'll make a lot of sense. For other people, it's actually very, very good stuff to know about. It's widely used. So it's called model predictive control. In fact, I've been reading a lot about it the last couple of days. Just had 2 very long airplane flights, read a couple more books on it. It's got tons of different names, all different. No one, basically no one, all the different areas doing this don't know about the others. Often the notation and stuff is absolutely horrible. So anyway, here's the basic idea. We'll get this in a minute. It's basically, there's a bigger area. This is actually a name. Model predictive control is the name that comes from a relatively small community. It's the people. In fact, I read one book and heard, I guess since I'm sort of a member of this community, us referred to as the control community. And that was as opposed to some others. Anyway, other names would be used. One I think that is a very good name in a sense is embedded optimization, real-time optimization. So, and actually the way that fits into the future I think is very, very interesting. People think of optimization. A lot of people have their view of optimization locked into a model that's from 1969. Either because they learned it in 1969, or they learned it from someone who learned it in 1969, or they learned it from someone who learned it in 1969. So they think of optimization as this big, complicated, very big thing that requires several PhDs, a bunch of supercomputers and things like that. And you really wouldn't use optimization except maybe to, I don't know, design a nuclear weapon, design the newest airplane, schedule United Airlines for tomorrow, or who knows what else. But these are the kinds of things or price a derivative in the basement of Goldman Sachs. These are the things people think of when you think of optimization. You already know that a lot of these things actually are extremely reliable. They're reliable enough to just work always, period, end of story. And they're also very, very fast. And by the time, if you say fast and reliable, then it means you're automatically talking something that's a candidate for embedding in real-time systems, right? Because these are the only 2 qualities you need to embed in a real-time system. Something's got to be fast, have bounded runtime, and it's got to be extremely reliable. It can't require, a PhD to come over and say, "Oh, your algorithm's jammed. Let me change the number here. Let me restart it from a different point." You can do that if you're doing some big problem, 40 days to run, that's fine. But if you're making a decision every 2.6 milliseconds, you obviously can't do that. So, okay. So the bigger name for this lecture would be embedded or real-time optimization. So, okay, so let's start. I think it's a very interesting area. I think you're going to see a whole lot of it more in the future. So, all right. So let's start with an optimal control problem. And there's some beautiful, there are very nice subtleties here. It's quite complicated, the idea, although unfortunately when it's taught, many times the subtleties just aren't seen. But they're actually very important subtleties. So I'm going to go over them a little bit, because it actually takes some time to actually really understand what it means. So here's what we're going to have. We're going to have a linear dynamical system. So that's xt plus 1 is a x of t plus b u of t. And this U is going to be our input or control or action. We start from a state Z. These input and controls have to be in some set U. The X's have to lie in some set script X. And our objective is a sum over the entire trajectory of functions. This is called the stage cost or something like that, of the state and the control. Now this is very traditional, and you'd find this in like vehicle control if you've taken a course on control or something like that. But in fact, this describes tons and tons of problems, including supply chain management, things like scheduling and networking in networks and in computer systems. It just goes on and on and on. A lot of problems in finance look exactly like this. I mean, some don't, but many do. So even though I'm using the traditional symbols that you would find, for example, in a course in Aeroastro describing vehicle control, this can just as well be a finance or economic system or something else, or a supply chain system. So don't let the notation of the, as this book I was reading said, the control community fool you. This is much more general than controlling your local robot or something. Actually, it doesn't actually include your robot because the dynamics are linear. But, okay. So the variables are an infinite number of inputs, and we can also treat the states as variables too, in which case we think of these as equality constraints. Now, the other option is to not think of the states as variables and to think of this as merely a recursion which relates the x's, which are expressions, and in fact affine expressions, to the variables. But these are actually equivalent. Okay. Now the data to the problem is this dynamics matrix A, this input matrix B, this stage cost function, and we'll assume that it's 0 at 0. So in other words, if you're at 0, that's some costless point or something like that. And we'll assume that these are convex and they include 0. You can actually change all of these assumptions pretty much, and it just makes things more complicated. Okay, so the first thing one can have is something called greedy control. And it's sort of the most obvious thing. And it works like this. What you do is you simply pick the input u to minimize the current stage cost. Here, that's what this does. Over your allowed control actions. And the only part of the future you intend to take into account is the following. Because of your action w, the next state is going to be ax of t plus bw. And the only counting of the future you will take care of is that must be in this state state constraint set. So that's greedy control. And the basic idea is it minimizes the current stage cost, and it ignores the entire the effect on the future. Well, except for this, it says that you can't do anything that would get you into trouble, serious trouble, namely violating the state constraint on the next step. As to whether or not you'll violate in the next step, that's entirely possible and too bad. Now, this method typically works very poorly. Of course, we can make it work very well, no problem. If A here, for example, is very small, for example, if it has a very small spectral radius or a very small norm, it means that the x at each state doesn't depend much on the current, the next state doesn't depend much on the current state. And then that tells you that basically the dynamic system has what people would call something like strongly fading memory. And that means that, in fact, greedy is not too far from optimal because although your current action does have an effect that propagates into the future, the effect goes down fast. I mean, for example, if the norm of A is 0.1, that would certainly be the case here. The greedy control would probably work well. Okay. So if you haven't seen optimal control and dynamic programming, actually, how many people have seen this somewhere? No. Good. That's good. That's how many people should have seen it. I mean, this is sort of like Fourier transforms. You need to see it maybe 3 times minimum, maybe 4. Maybe it's more important actually, but I guess that's a question. That's open for argument or something like that. So you should see it 3 or 4 times. So this will be your whatever 3rd or 4th time for some of you. If it's your 0th time, that's fine too. So first time. Here's the way it works. You define v of z is the optimal value of this problem right here. So it is the optimal value of this problem. That's an infinite dimensional problem. The variables here are the u's and the x's. It's infinite dimensional. It has an optimal value, and it's a function of z. Now, in fact, the optimal value of a convex problem, that's an infinite dimensional one, but still, the optimal value of a convex optimization problem as a function of the right-hand sides of inequalities or equalities is convex in those parameters. So The optimal value of this function is a convex function of z. Okay? So that's general. By the way, you know that rule very well. You know that rule in lots of other, in specific contexts. For example, the minimum of a quadratic function over some variables is another convex quadratic function. It's given by the Schur complement. So that's a very specific case where you know a computational, you can say much more about it. But in general, you know it's just true. Okay. So we form this function v, and that's called the value function. I should say that there seems to be a weird, once again, MIT and other places split in typical notation. So some people use j as the value of the, I'll have to hunt down the source of this. J is the function of the, is the objective. And then a lot of people use then v for the value function. And at MIT it's reversed. This is G. It's not. They don't use V. This is J. So if you look in books from MIT or something, the value function is called J. However, it is always called the value function or the Bellman function or, and I forget what the Russian name for it is, but it's one of those. But I think the Russian symbol is V. So anyway, just to comment on the notation. And this is convex. It's actually extremely easy to just show it. I mean, so just to show it directly. And the important part is that it satisfies this Bellman or dynamic programming or Hamilton-Jacobi equation, many other names, Pontryagin equation. And it says this. It's actually quite interesting. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but it makes perfect sense. And in fact, it's extremely easy to just show. It looks deep. A lot of people make it. They want you to think it's very complicated and deep, and it's actually not. It basically says the following. It says that if you want to do if you want to make the right choice right now from state z, here's what you do. Well, when you take an action z, you're going to run up the bill LZW. That's immediate. So the extremely greedy control would say this: choose W to minimize this. That would be the extremely greedy control. Well, that's not good because you have to at least take an action that will land you in an allowed state next step. So that's the next level of, that's the first plausible greedy method. But then as a result of your action, as a result of choosing W, here's where you land, AZ plus BW. So far we've already said that's feasible, that's okay. But the question is, how should you take into account your current action, the effect of your current action on where you land? Well, in fact, if you imagine where you land, if you then simply carried out the optimal control from then, it couldn't get any better than that. And so it turns out this is what you should do. You should add to the current cost, the current bill you run up, plus the bill you would run up for landing in this state and thereafter doing exactly the right thing. So that's what this says. And it says if you add these two together and minimize over W, then this will actually equal V. It's the optimal thing to do. And not only that, but the argmin of this thing is the optimal U. Right? And it looks complicated. It's really not. It's like basically, it's because like the inf of the inf is the, you can, if you take an infimum, you can minimize in any order and it doesn't make any difference, right? So that's really what it is. So this is a dynamic programming equation. By itself, it says absolutely nothing, doesn't help in the slightest, because, well, in fact, you have to figure out, well, then you'd say like, well, so what's V? What is interesting is that in some cases you can actually find V. Once you've found V, you actually have the solution here. And there's actually one thing I want to point about this. This optimal input is in fact a function of the state x of t, because although it's complicated, that's a function. It's a function of the current state, so that's what it is. In other words, that the optimal input has the form some function phi of x of t. So people would call this state feedback form would be the common way to say that. So, and that's it's quite interesting. So, and here, as I said, the interpretation is this: that this term v of a x of t plus bw is very important. It's basically the accounting term needed to completely accurately account for the effect on the future cost of your current action. So that's exactly what that's exactly what this thing is here. Okay. So one famous case where this actually leads to a numerical solution, well, basically a solution, is this. You have linear convex quadratic, linear convex optimal control, well, linear quadratic optimal control. So the stage cost is x transpose qx plus u transpose ru. You know, it's easy to add a cross term between x and u, and it's easy to add a linear term and all that kind of stuff. And you know, this would be very just sort of like exercises. Q is traditionally positive semi-definite, and R is positive definite. That's just to keep the formulas simple. Okay, now in this case, you can actually solve the problem by dynamic programming. It turns out the value function is quadratic. That's hardly a surprise, right? Because you basically have an infinite dimensional quadratic problem with an infinite number of variables. You know that for a finite dimensional quadratic function, if you minimize over some variables, the result is quadratic in the others. In fact, the result is a sure complement in the others. You know that already. So this merely extends that to the infinite dimensional case. And in fact, sure complement is the right thing because it's very, very close. This, in fact, if you stare at this long enough, you'll see a sure complement here. I should have written it that way. I don't know why I didn't. You could take the A transpose and the A out of these two terms, and you will see, I don't know how good your sure complement visualization skills are, but you should see a sure complement. Anyway, it's plausible, right? Because a sure complement is, you know, blah minus something, something inverse, something transpose, where the third something was the same as the first something, or something. Like, anyway, you know what I mean. So anyway, that's a sure complement. So shouldn't be surprising. So the value function is quadratic in this case. In a sense, it is a sure complement of an infinitely big positive quadratic function, and you minimize over infinitely many variables, leaving just n left, and the result is in fact a giant infinite dimensional sure complement, but it has an explicit solution. The P, this is the Bellman equation, now written out. Because they're quadratic forms, it just says the two matrices are the same, and you get this. Now, by the way, there's no reason to believe that you can solve this. It's a quadratic matrix equation. So there's lots of ways to solve this, one just by iterating and things like that. So I'm not going to get into that. But this would give you a so-called, this equation can be solved quite effectively. And in this case, the optimal policy is a linear state feedback. So it just looks like this. U star is k x of t, where k is this thing here. So, and you can actually, I mean, you can see all sorts of various interesting things here about what happens when p gets big and when it's small and all that kind of stuff. You get very interesting. You can actually work out a lot of the behavior. This thing, I think, a bunch of people have actually. How many people have seen this? I'm just sort of curious. Okay, so if you've seen this, you probably know this is extremely widely used. Even in cases where systems aren't linear and so on like that, and it is unbelievably effective. I mean, state feedback gains like this just work really well. So, in particular, it's sort of like least squares. I mean, it's almost like magic. It's almost like magic in the sense that when you synthesize state feedback gains like this, I mean, this is not interesting if the state is small and u is small, but if you've got 20 dimensions and five inputs, that's 100 numbers in there, and the 100 numbers just come out. It's just like calculating a pseudo-inverse and then doing image processing. It would have taken you a long time to adjust those 100 numbers by hand to get something that even works, let alone works so well. So this is widely used. Okay. Now we're going to look at this finite horizon approximation. And so this is quite straightforward. What we do is instead of solving this infinite dimensional problem, what we're going to do is we're simply going to run it out to time capital T, that's some horizon. And what we'll do is we'll insist that when you arrive at the end of this horizon, you drive the state to 0. Now, once the state is 0, you have the option of putting in input 0, 0, 0 after that. And so we're actually essentially looking at a finite dimensional subspace of possible inputs. They simply, the inputs go out to a certain amount of time, they drive to state exactly to 0. That's this. Thereafter, you apply 0 to the whole thing. And so this would give you, that's a valid input. I mean, a valid input on infinite horizon. That's what this is. Okay. Now, then you have a finite dimensional convex problem. We can solve that easily. And this will give you a suboptimal input for the original optimal control problem. Why? Because it's basically you're looking over a finite dimensional subspace. It's the finite dimensional it's a subspace of signals, of inputs, and states that vanish after time t. That's a finite dimensional subspace. And you solve a problem over a subspace, you certainly get an approximation. You'll get an upper bound. So let's just do an example. I don't know, a system with like 3 states and 2 inputs. It really doesn't matter. It's just completely random. Just quadratic stage cost. And we'll have a limit on the state. None of the components can be bigger than 1. And same for the inputs. They have to be less than 0.5. Who knows why? And then here's our input. And the optimal cost turns out to be 8.83. And I can, if you're curious, I can tell you why that's not an approximation. That's the exact number. So I'll explain it in a minute. Not that it matters. I'll get back to that in a minute. So here's the cost versus horizon. So in this problem, it turns out it takes 10 steps. In other words, if you say get to the origin, it's infeasible for 10 steps. You know, because you have some state, it propagates forward in time. You have an input which is limited between plus minus 0.5. There's just limited amount you can do. By the way, those of you who are in 263, I should say that I made fun of it then, but I'll make fun of it even more now. There's very traditional ideas of like, controllability and all this. I don't know if you remember this. If you've blocked it out, that was the right thing to do. Because it's just it's like, it asks, it's perfectly okay. It's the first thing you ask, can you wiggle the input to get to take the state to 0 or something? And you get these kind of silly things involving ranges and all that. And that's all fine. But the real question is not, can you maneuver the state to 0 in capital T steps? The real question is, can you do it with an input signal that's less than minus 0.5? That's actually a real question. That one's of interest, and no, stupid theory of controllability is going to tell you that. Okay, so this is, in my opinion, this is the real theory of control. This is the first theory that's actually useful. Business with B, A squared B, and all that. The Krylov subspace, as we now know it, being full rank and everything. I don't know. It's classical, and I'm just not even sure if it has. As far as I know, it doesn't really have any actual use. But okay. So here's a real controllability analysis. It tells you, can you hit the origin? And it says that for even in 9 steps, you can't do it. It's infeasible, so the cost is plus infinity. In 10 steps, you can do it at a cost of 11.5, and then in, I don't know what this is, in 11, you can do it down this way. And you can actually see something here that this is converging very, very quickly. This is very common. It's not universal. I should say, obviously, this is monotone decreasing. But in fact, it's there's a lot that would tell you that this thing is going to converge very quickly. So in other words, and it makes sort of sense because the optimal inputs, I'll show you what they look like. So here's the actual infinite dimensional optimal input. And you can see very carefully what happens here. The input looks like this, but then after a while it's dying down like this, and then that's dying down like that. And so the point is, this is falling off exponentially, and here, it's not going to take, if I tell you, in fact, you have to be 0 at t equals 30, it takes very little perturbation of this input signal to drive this state actually to 0 here, and not have it be merely small. It takes just minor perturbation. So that's why these things converge very, very quickly. Okay, so this is the cost versus horizon. And I was curious, actually, people who've had these courses, I don't know, 207, 210, anyone know how we calculated that line? This is just for those who have the background. Look, it would be perfectly okay to just do this, actually. Perfectly normal would be to solve this for t equals 50 or 100 and numerically say that's it. They're perfectly acceptable. But in fact, you can calculate it exactly. Up to just numerical round-off error. Now we did it? Do you know?
difficulty get the P?
This is with constraints. Yeah, so here's how you do it. This is just an aside, but just for fun, if you have the background. You can show in a problem like this that you can compute an ellipsoid in state space such that if you're in the ellipsoid, the optimal control is in fact coincides with the linear one because you'll never saturate, never in the future, and therefore from then on it's given by an explicit formula. In fact, it's this formula right here. This is an advanced topic, so just ignore me if you don't know what I'm talking about. Also, I'm going the wrong way. Here. There we go. So it's given by this formula. And once you have that, you can actually evaluate the cost to go by solving a Lyapunov equation. So, okay. So if you knew what I was talking about, fine. If you don't, just ignore what I just said. But okay. And if you look here, you can see all sorts of things. Oh, this is the first time the U. This is the smallest amount of time you can possibly drive the state to 0. And you can see this is really quite different. The input is quite different, although actually, curiously, it doesn't start off that differently here, right? I mean, it basically says, you know, what I'm just showing you U, but I think maybe there's several U's. I forget. I don't know why we're showing 2 inputs. Okay, so this is one of the U's. I don't know which it is. We'll fix this typo. It's either U1 or U2. I mean, not that it matters, right? But so you see it does something and then it pulls back. This is all because you have to drive the state to 0. There's 2 other states as well that get driven to 0 here at 10. So, okay. All right. Now this brings us to model predictive control. So this is something I think everybody should know about this. So unfortunately it's considered part of control. It's not even mainstream control because it's considered part of like industrial control. I think it's really stupid. It's incredibly effective for all sorts of things. It goes like this. Here's the way it's going to go. And there's some subtleties, so I'm going to go over this. I'm going to take some time to do it right. It's time t, and here's what you do. You solve the following problem. You have a planning horizon, capital T, and so from time t forward, capital T periods, you are going to assess a cost. All of this is essentially a planning exercise, and it's going to work like this. You're going to propagate forward the dynamics of the system. You are going to start at the current state. So you're in a current state at x equals t. You will do a planning exercise, which will actually propagate the state forward, capital T samples. You will insist that capital T samples in the future, you must hit 0. By the way, there's variations on this so-called terminal constraint, but the easiest is to put that there. So you'll do this planning exercise. So literally at time t, you will work out an optimal control that would take the state to 0 in capital T steps, starting from there, and so on. By the way, if you then were to execute this is at this point, the U's here they constitute a plan for the future. If you were to execute that plan, then the state would indeed be at capital T plus capital T, it would go to 0. But the clever part is this. You're going to do a complete planning exercise, and you're simply going to use the first input. Then you're going to step T forward 1 unit, and you're going to replan again. So your horizon has just moved. And that's how this works. So your horizon has just moved far. It's always like, if capital T is 30, you're always planning to drive the state to 0 in 30 steps. That's at all times. That's the way it's working. So that's, by the way, another name for this is receding horizon control, finite look-ahead control, dynamic linear programming, because in a lot of supply chain problems, these are linear or piecewise linear. So it's got lots and lots of names. Including it probably comes up in lots of places where it doesn't have a name because it's kind of so obvious. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, the fact is, this is actually also a state feedback. It's a fantastically complicated state feedback. Well, it's not that complicated. To tell you the truth, it's piecewise linear. We'll get to that in a minute. But it's quite complicated because it basically takes a bunch of data, namely x of t, and solves a big QP in order to calculate a full trajectory. So I'm just trying to think if I should draw a picture. Well, why not? I mean, it's the basic idea. I guess it's kind of obvious, but just to make sure. So the way it works is, here's time, and you're right here, and so what you do is you make yourself a plan of input, something like this, like that. That will take the state to 0 at this time, like that. So this is the plan that you execute at this time step. You then simply execute this. That's the U that you actually apply. You then step forward 1 to this point, but now your plan has gone off here. Your horizon has extended. There's other versions where it doesn't. Your horizon has extended here, and now there's no reason to believe that you'll do this. If you did this, you would actually take it to 0. But now, actually, what's happened is your requirements have relaxed. You had 30 steps to take the state to 0 before. You step forward now, and now instead of at 79, it's 80 you have to hit. And so, in fact, this one might relax. It might be, I won't be so aggressive. It'll be slightly lower. And so you can actually watch this, and then it would take it to here. So, okay. So this is the basic idea. It's complicated. I mean, it's actually really interesting. You solve, in this case, you solve a convex problem every step. So for that baby example we have, here's the way it works. Well, this is the MPC compared to the optimal. And you see something just totally insane here, which is basically if you tell this thing, plan 10 steps in the future. By the way, if you ask it to plan 9 steps in the future, it can't even hit. It's not even feasible. So you'd say, plan, at all times, I would like you to act as if, I want you to file a full legitimate plan that 10 steps in the future would take the state to 0. And here's how well it works compared to optimal. So, but if you say like 11 or 12, it's optimal. Yeah?
The way the graph is drawn, it seems a little bit unfair to put them both on the same horizontal scale because one just requires a lot more computation than the other, wouldn't it?
Yes. Right. Right. So this one, we do have to explain a few things. This one was calculated, as I said, by solving a QP big enough and then adding on an end from a Lyapunov equation. That's correct. And this one here was done, each point on that curve was done by solving one QP. Very good point. This thing was done by solving a QP for 40 steps or 50 steps or something. So you are right. The computation involved here is much more. That's correct. Yeah. So, even though it's a baby example and it's not always this dramatic, there's a hint here that things like this work really, really well. I mean, really well. And the reason is actually pretty simple. It does make sense, and it goes something like this. As you pointed out, you're solving, 50 QPs here. Basically, you're solving 50 different quadratic programs or something like that. At all time, the QP you're solving is to minimize you're making a plan of action for t steps in the future. So let's make it 12. So you're like out here. I mean, you're basically doing flawlessly. So you're basically at all times you're filing a plan of action to take the state to 0 in 12 steps. What happens at the next? You then execute only the first input. You step forward, and now instead of saying, well, it has to be 0 at that time when it has to be 0 has shifted. Okay. So let me explain why this works well. There's a sense in which at each step you basically compute a whole action. It's an action plan, is what it is. It means is if you were to get the signal all over, done, quit, stop, everything like that, then you'd execute that plan, and 12 steps over, 12 or whatever it is, capital T steps later, you'd bring the thing to 0. So at all times you have sort of a plan, a viable plan that would halt the system in 15 steps. That's kind of or whatever capital T is, right? So in fact, when you have t equals 15, you're calculating 15 values of the input. But only one you use, only the first one. The other 14 values of the input is nothing but a planning exercise, and its only reason for being there is so that you don't do something stupid now that messes you up for the future. So that is the only reason for that planning to be there. And by the way, once you realize that that's the basic idea, that the reason you're making a full planning is just so you don't do something now stupid with respect to the future, then it starts making sense that, well, you could do a crappy job of planning, you could do all, and you would expect it to actually work. So, I mean, this sort of makes sense. I mean, imagine this in some kind of a cash flow problem, right? Where you're managing some cash flow. I mean, that'll actually be something from next lecture, which is stochastic MPC. But in a cash flow problem, you'd say, look, I've got inputs and now I've got expenses, I've got income and stuff like that. And what you do is you do some planning now. What you do now has a huge effect on the future, right? You invest in some fixed income security, that matures in 3 months. It's going to be a cost now, but it'll be a benefit in 3 months. You run your cash balance down real low now to pay for something. Then you're going to have to borrow, and that'll be expensive when you have expenses coming up. Everybody see how I mean, it's the exact same problem. So MPC there would do just what you'd imagine. You basically do, in fact, what you're required to do if you're a CFO or something like that. You actually have just a plan. You make a plan for the next 12 quarters on cash flow. Now, so far, everything's deterministic. So we sort of assume nothing's going to change. We'll see that the real advantage comes when, in fact, things are not what you predict them to be. That's stochastic control. That's the next topic.
Is there a way to solve this problem if the dynamics are also changing with the state?
If they are changing, but linear, yes, that's no problem. But if they are nonlinear, it's not a convex problem. And you know what my recommendation would be then? I don't know, lecture, whatever it was, sequential convex programming. It'll work quite well.
If
Yeah.
the dynamics are changing, do you have to keep solving more feasibility problems to figure out your horizon? It seems like before you do this problem, you have to figure out the feasibility problem to get your minimum.
Right.
Or you can overshoot it, right?
Right. So we'll get to that. Generally speaking, you don't. If you're running into feasibility issues, your horizon is too short. The other thing is that when you run this, believe it or not, it'll work perfectly well if you violate feasibility. So if instead of saying x of t is equal to x of t plus big T is equal to 0, I put a big charge on capital X of t, like 10 times its absolute value, or 1 norm or something like that. This would work well now, even believe it or not, or tolerably, it would work out here. Because it would just try its best to get that state 0. I mean, it wouldn't get great performance, but it wouldn't just like stop, right? So, yeah. So feasibility, when you do these methods, you have to deal with gracefully, right? Because if you do a plan for the future, and someone says, so let me see your plan, and here it is. It's like nan, right? That's. Yeah, so you have to relax all the things. This just makes it easiest to present.
So just a question, has anybody looked at like difference type forms so you could reuse some of the the computations you had done?
Excellent question. Okay, so when this is running, there should be something that's very clear. That basically, at each step, you just did a full. You basically did, if you're the CFO, you actually worked out basically how to wind up operations in 2.5 years, right? But do so, by the way, minimizing your total expense or maximizing your lifetime or what time to live or whatever it was. I mean, it's a very simple thing. Now you step forward, and you're actually solving almost the same problem, right? That's your point. That can be exploited unbelievably well by using a warm start method. And then that gets back to your question, which is the computational complexity. So it is true that you're solving 50 LPs. Here, QPs, 50 QPs. But you're solving 50 QPs, and each is only a very minor perturbation on the other. And in fact, if you use a warm start method, I guarantee it'll be 2 Newton steps. to go. So basically, what happens is if someone says, okay, now t is 17, let's figure out what to do. And you say, okay, well, what I have to do is I have to do a plan from t equals 17 to t equals 29. That's if capital T is 12. Okay? But you just did a plan from 16 to 28. So you take that plan, and that's your initial point for your new plan. 2 Newton steps, promise you. 2 Newton steps, 3, I don't know. It's all over. Done. So in fact, these things are fast. But we'll get to that.
Just a little comment about the plot.
Yeah.
This is a little misleading because what you're saying when the finite horizon control problem is like in 15 steps you are going
You
to
mean
reach
compare
zero.
this one to this one?
And-
Yeah,
and
right.
the other one is a strategy to compute like a suboptimal strategy to compute the optimal cost.
I agree.
And you are actually going to reach near zero or some region near zero within some epsilon radius near zero in some like 100 steps or 50 steps, not really in like 10 steps. Which
Right, no, I know. But technically, okay, that is true, but let me point something out. Technically, all three of these are showing the same thing. This one doesn't depend on a horizon because it's the exact global optimal.
Right.
Okay? Now, this one says, bring that state to 0 in 15 steps and then stop.
Right.
That's a viable U. I mean, it's a U, it brings the state to 0, and then it just sits there. It runs up a bill.
But if you look at your
It
first
runs up
MPC
this bill. What's that?
If you look at your first MPC iteration, it will actually look, it will see that as if you are incurring a cost of 11.5.
Right.
And then it will suddenly realize that I have only used first input, then my cost is going to
Right.
reduce.
Well, what happened was at this point, what happened, let's say for this MPC thing, on the first step, it's actually quite rushed, right? Because it's basically saying, you minimize this cost, take the state to 0 in 11 steps. It basically, in 9 steps, it's impossible. It's not even feasible to do. So it's feeling quite rushed, and it's got some input that just barely does it. Then what happens is that the next step, the horizon moves another step forward. Right. So I think they're perfectly okay. I don't know. I think I'm not. They're showing different things, but it's okay. So here are the trajectories generated. This is for MPC with t equals 10. And I guess the point is here that, at least visually, I mean, you know already, you've seen the plot. They're kind of the same.
Games like this where you have 2 players.
Yes.
And both of them. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so people have done games too this way. Yeah. Yeah, infinite versions of this and all sorts of other stuff. So, okay, so here, if you look carefully, I mean, you can see that these are, well, they have to be close, right, because the costs were close, but I mean, they're shockingly close. But the point is that this input is coming from this is calculated in a very different way. This is calculated by solving one QP, essentially infinite horizon, let's leave it that way. Here, that's what this does. This says that this point was found by saying wind up in 10 steps. Then it moves forward. It creates a whole plan for winding up in 10 steps, moves forward 1 step. Now it's t equals 2. And it says, now given the state you're in, plan to wind up in 10 steps. So what's shocking is that each planning exercise is stressful in the sense that it's not even feasible for 9 steps to get there. Well, it might actually start being feasible once the state has been reduced. But at first, it's not even feasible. So each planning exercise is stressful, but the resulting input generated by a sequence of stressful planning exercises is actually superb. Okay, so, I mean, this obviously doesn't always happen, but this is pointing out something which is correct in practice, and that is that these things work like spookily well. I mean, if you have to solve problems like this, things like this, you should do this. Okay. Now, I've already said some of this. It's got lots of names. In the 70s, this was propagated all across chemical process plants, and it had the name dynamic matrix control. You might want to ask why. The matrix means that they wrote a big matrix that related the future inputs to the future outputs. I'm not kidding. That's what it is. So that was heavy technology, but widely used. There's like 4 companies. They propagate, used just everywhere now. So if you go to a big chemical processing plant, it's almost certain this is what they're using. Let's see. And they can get quite fancy. By the way, I remember talking to someone from Shell Canada, and he said that they actually have in these things that are, so I'm talking about big, big giant process plant, right? Which are, by the way, this is very impressive because these are also very dangerous, right? You send the wrong signals to a giant cracking tower, and you can be very, very sorry. They're extremely high value assets, as you can imagine, right? So he said that actually in the QP, there's coefficients that go into that QP, into the cost function, come from analysts and things like spot futures prices and things like that for the future. So so then I pointed out to him, I said, that means that some guy in Chicago, who raises a card, it's not done that way, but anyway, raises a card on something, actually more or less directly ends up affecting valves and pumps in Ottawa. And he thought about it for a minute and he said, yes, that's true. So I think it's kind of cool, actually. I mean, I think it's cool. Anyway, so, okay. It's got lots of names, rolling horizon planning. A lot of people do it, don't even say it. So that's the other, that's the other thing. Now, actually, what's interesting is it's propagated into industries where the dynamics are slow. So, in fact, I just recently found out it's what's used, though not called MPC. It's used in so-called revenue management. You know what that is? That's basically these sleazy ways companies get to part with more of your money, most of your money possible. And you'll be happy to know this is what's doing it. So this is how they release the number of airline seats at this price, and then they change it, then more, and then more, and then they sense desperation. Like if you say, no, I needed to be at this meeting in Chicago, they go like, ooh, it's really expensive. I'm sorry about that. And you sit next to someone who paid 1/12 the price. Or so. Anyway, that's got the euphemism for that is revenue management. They're managing it all right. And it's as far as I know, at least according to a friend of mine in business school, these are the methods used. Although no one doing it would recognize the terms model predictive control. They'd say, never heard of it. They would call it revenue management, and it would be this. Okay, so all right. Let me say a few more things about it. Actually, there is something very important about this that I should say, and I think it's extremely relevant. And that's this. And I think you hit it right. You went right to the key point. The key point is in these systems, in these methods, if you're running control, you're solving a problem, a convex problem at every step. Now, if you think about control and things like that, things that run in real time, that is very non-traditional, right? So the way controls that were implemented in many industries up until recently, and including in many now, is the control which runs at real time is just a very small amount of calculation, right? You spend $1 billion and all sorts of stuff to figure out some control gains. But then that actual control code is like, 14 lines of C. Got a couple of switches in it, a couple of flops and things like that. And then it can be checked for correctness like, a zillion times or whatever. Then it's installed in a flight controller. Not, by the way, because, it's updated so fast. These things are only updated at like 50 hertz or something like that. So you have 20 milliseconds. It's just for tradition and various other things. Okay, everybody see what I'm saying? So so the most common type of control is like, PID, which is proportional integral derivative, and basically requires about, three multiplies per step or something, right? You get the new error, you get the new output, compare it to your target. That's your error. Oh, you do have to add that to the previous integral error, right? And then you multiply by 3 numbers, and that's what you do. Everybody see what I'm saying? So when computers were slow, this all made a lot of sense. And people who did traditional control ignored this entirely through the 70s and 80s because they said, it's a special thing. I mean, it works because chemical process plants have very slow dynamics that go for like 24 hours. And so if you have 15 minutes, you can go ahead, solve a QP every 15 minutes. What do we care? If you're doing revenue management, solve a QP every 15 minutes. What do we care? LP in that case, right? Go right ahead. Everybody. So people who did sort of the real-time control, I said, oh no, I work on robots. I work on jet engines. My updates. I do networks. Our decisions have to be made at the at the millisecond or microsecond level. I work on the kernel. I have to schedule processes. I don't have 15 minutes to figure out what to schedule next. I've got to make decisions every millisecond. So there's a whole bunch of areas like that where whether those people know it or not, this is coming for them. Just mostly they don't know it, but this is coming. Okay. So let's look at some variations. I've already mentioned this, that instead of insisting that the final state be 0, you can make a final state cost, make up some v hat equals v. By the way, if the final state cost were exactly the cost to go function, then no matter how short the horizon, you would actually get the exact optimal input. In other words, even if it was one step, well, that's literally the Bellman equation. The Bellman equation says, let's do some planning. Ready? Let's plan only what you're going to do right now. But then you say, well, how do I account for the future cost? And you go, by the exact effect on the future cost. That would be V. If you put that accounting in and optimize greedily, locally in time, you get the exact optimal. Everybody see what I'm saying? So you might imagine, so for example, the endpoint condition, x of capital T plus capital T, is 0. That is effectively a V hat. It's the following V hat. It's 0 when x is 0, and it's plus infinity otherwise. Not exactly what you'd call a superb estimate of the cost to go. But so anyway, you can put in an approximation of a cost to go here. It'll work really well. For example, if a problem is like linear quadratic and 0 is in the interior of the thing, you can actually solve the Riccati equation and put x transpose px as this thing, and you'll just get, amazingly good controls at that point. So just that's one thing. And it also deals with the non-feasibility issue quite gracefully. In other words, that way, when someone says, "Can I see your plan?" it's not going to be nan as inputs, right? Okay. Well, again, on that topic, you would convert hard constraints to violation penalties because you don't want to just say, "I can't make the plan." What you do is you just violate some penalties. What's really weird about this is you'd think things would work poorly. Actually, you can actually run MPC where all of your planning exercises are actually infeasible. In other words, if you freeze it and you say, "What are you doing?" You say, "Well, I'm planning my actions for the next 14 steps." And you go, "Great. What are you going to do?" "Well, I wanted to make the final state 0, but it's infeasible. Also, I'm violating a few things. I'm violating the dynamics equations and things like that." And you're like, "You call that a plan?" And you go, "Hey, it's real time." So shockingly, those things actually work really well. Even though, and it kind of makes sense because if you think of it this way, if you think, what's the plan for? The plan is there only so that you don't do something stupid now with respect to the future. So if your planning is not perfect, well, I guess if it's infeasible, it's a little bit worse than not perfect. At least it's some kind of rough plan. So you couldn't execute it, but anyway, all right. Another variation is this. You can solve the MPC problem every capital K steps. So that's basically what happens is at T, you plan out capital T steps, and you plan out a whole trajectory, and you execute the first 5. You just do those. Then after 5 steps, you see what state you're in. There's no disturbances here, so the truth is you know what state you're in. Your horizon also shoots back 5 steps, and you replan. So that's another variation on these. There are lots of variations. Okay. Now let me talk about explicit MPC. And this is a special case for these. The loss function is quadratic, and then these are polyhedral. The state and input constraints sets are polyhedra. Then it turns out that phi MPC is actually piecewise affine. Okay? And it looks shocking or cool or something, but it's not. It turns out the solution of any quadratic program is piecewise affine in the right-hand sides of the constraints. So, and that comes straight from the KKT conditions. So in other words, by the way, this comes up in machine learning also, that when you do like an L1 regularized problem, and you put your lambda there, you can say lots of things about the x, like that it's piecewise affine in lambda, and I don't know, you can say various other things about it. But it's a good thing to know, and it's not hard to see. So what that says is that you could actually, it says that well, theoretically it says that for any QP, if you were going to vary, if you're going to solve a QP with many instances of the right-hand side, you could actually pre-compute an explicit lookup table for the solution. Now, you could do this for any QP, for any application. Now, what happens then is you simply calculate these regions, and then your code looks like this. Your x, which I'll call your parameter or whatever it is, or let's call your parameter p. P comes in, and the first thing you do is you find out which region p is in, and then you simply apply, you know, kp plus g, where the k and g are the correct ones for that region. Okay, so that's how that's how that works. Now, it works for, you know, this is practical for very small problems only. I mean, certainly in MPC, I mean, just quite small things, you know, with, I mean, these are things like 2 and 3 and things like that. Small numbers of constraints. Now, people have pioneered in the last like 5 or 6 years methods to actually analytically construct these things. And they make very pretty pictures. You can go, if you type explicit MPC into Google or something, you'll see beautiful pictures with a two-dimensional state space and some kind of tessellation and 180 regions. And they've actually used these things. They've used them in anesthesia. They've used them in also in a switching power supply. So, I mean, these things are used. Also, it turns out in this case, I mean, obviously these can get slow very quickly, which is kind of the whole point was to make it fast or something. Again, this comes from 1969 mentality. 1969 mentality was solving a QP is a big deal. That's 1969 mentality. Big thing. You need a big supercomputer. You need expensive software, a couple of PhDs to sit around. You know, big, you know, 208 volt, 3-phase, 50 amps. I mean, people just think of it. It's like a big deal. Anyway, as you all know, it is nothing. You can write one in MATLAB in 20 minutes. You could, actually. It's just not that big a deal. You can write one in C in half an hour or something like that. So a lot of it is sort of mismotivated by that. Now you can do things to simplify these things and get quite good control. And there's another advantage to an explicit form. An explicit form is actually quite traditional in control. So that would be called gain scheduling or something like that. So that the person who's traditionally trained to make sure that before some control code is downloaded into something dangerous or expensive, they'll be very familiar with a switch, right? With a big C statement that says, you know, or case, and lists a bunch of cases, and in each case dials in a gain. That's completely standard. Okay. But in fact, again, if you think past the 1969 mentality and think about it, I guess in a post-1969 mentality, here's what you'd see. The MPC problem is highly structured. So, I mean, there's a whole section on this. But the Hessian is block diagonal. I'm not going to go into the details. The equality constraints is block banded. It's weird because the equality constraint matrix isn't square, so it's not clear what banded means. But if there were meaning of banded for a non-square matrix, this would be it. But actually, you know why you can guess this, and all you needed was your intuition to know this? And in fact, so this is one of the things I would hope you would eventually get. Hopefully by the end of this year you'll have it. It has to do with going from problem structure in the actual problem to the problem structure in the numerics and what are the implications. So let's just talk about that for a minute. Let's suppose you're solving an optimal control problem, and let me just ask you about the state x of t. What does it connect to? What are the other variables it's sort of directly constrained with or connected to? What's what?
T plus 1 and T
It's
minus
x of t is connected to u of t. It's connected, let's say it's connected to u of t minus 1 because the previous decision is what landed you in that state. And it's connected to xt plus 1 and xt minus 1. That's it. Whenever you can make a statement like that, now of course x of t is related to x of t plus 50, okay, but indirectly because it's got to propagate through all these dynamics and things like that. I mean, otherwise it's just a separate problem. But the key is whenever you can identify blocks of variables and say that in fact, what we just argued means it's banded. If you stack x and u, and x and u of t only depend kind of on x and u of t, the previous and post, by the way, you should recognize this. That smells like banded. That says banded. I mean, you have to go through and work out all the matrices and all that, but the point is at least you know what you're looking for, and you're looking for banded. And what does banded mean about solving it? It means blazing fast. It means linear in the time step. Okay? So that's the other thing you should know. Banded, how long does it take a Newton step if you have a band of 20 and it's a million long?
The k squared times.
Yeah, tiny is the answer. Super fast. And it's not easy solving million variables, million equations generally. Okay, so anyway, all right, so I just want to talk about the ideas. You should be used to this. Structure comes up other ways. I mean, in image processing, what structure comes up? What are pixels related to? I mean, typically,
The surroundings.
Yeah, some neighbors, okay? Do you get banded?
Yes.
No. You get banded across a line, but you're also related, so you get something called a Kronecker product of banded. You're related to your left and right neighbors, for sure. So things like signal processing, control, anything with time in it, banded. Images, you get actually a Kronecker product of band. You get weird bands because you're related to the guy to your left, the guy to your right, but you're also related to your neighbor above and your neighbor below. Okay, your more complicated 9-point. That just hardly changes anything, but it means that you're related here, and that's, by the way, an offset of n if you're going to do right. So the sparsity pattern also there you would expect to see would be like bands. Actually, it's a banded matrix of banded matrices. So, but the point is, it doesn't matter. The main thing you should recognize is structure. That's structure, and that means fast. If you know what you're doing. Okay. So you can actually solve this. I guess we've gone all over this. I don't have to tell you this. It's t times n plus m cubed. So to do this, it's linear in t. And so here's a fast MPC. In fact, it was just put together by Young. But we've already talked about a bit of some of the things here. First of all, you don't have to do a good job in the planning. So you might as well do an interior point method and fix the barrier parameter. And then you can use warm start, which I think, you asked about that, right? So you could do warm start. And then it turns out you only need to do like 2 Newton steps or something like that. And you don't really even, you can limit the number of Newton steps. And this is just a simple C implementation, not even optimized, didn't even compile it with whatever it is, 03 or whatever it's called. And these would be the numbers involved here. But here would be one. Here's a problem with, 4 states, 2 inputs, a time step of 10, and that goes down to 300 microseconds. You can have a problem with like 30 states, 8 inputs, 30 horizon. That's a problem with 1,000 variables and 3,000 constraints. That goes down to 23 milliseconds. Okay, so I don't mind. I just came back from Zurich, where people have been doing MPC for a long time, and they just didn't. Those who had the 1969 mentality successfully convinced other people that solving a QP is a big deal. By the way, these are also the same kind of people who just use tools and don't know how they work inside. So, because it won't work this way. If you fire this up in CVX, you'll get actually probably some very little CVX overhead time, and you'll get 3.4 seconds. Right. So anyway, this is actually why I think it's very important if you're going to use things like convex optimization, maybe you'll go into an area where it doesn't matter, and you can use high-level tools, and you can use other people's solvers. Good for you. Very good taste, very good judgment to go into a field like that. It requires a combination of modest number of variables and no real-time constraints. If you have the judgment to do that, in fact, if you don't, if you're considering fields, go into a field like that. However, the point is if you go into others, if you go into something that's huge, you're going to have to write your own solver. We went over that a couple of weeks ago. If you do anything that's real-time, you're also going to have to write your own. But it's really easy. I mean, it is not hard, provided you know what you're doing. And if you've taken 364A and B, you know what you're doing. So maybe, hopefully. You should know what you're doing, or something like that. By the way, I just don't think, I don't want to make I do want to make a big deal over this. There's not a lot of people outside this room who actually know these numbers. These are not, even though like everybody should know them, I know all the experts who write all the big codes. If I ask them how fast would you solve, actually no one even thinks about solving small problems. These are small by, so even the experts in the world, when you ask them how fast can you solve that, they'll say a couple of seconds, right there. And that won't help you if you're controlling a robot or something like that, or doing navigation updates or whatever it is. So anyway, so I personally happen to think there's a lot of opportunity for MPC running at rates like 50 hertz, 60 hertz, and so on. By the way, there's other areas where this comes up. There was a student who did a project in 364, like, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, that had to do with optimizing guard bands and wireless transmission, and it's like an SOCP with I don't know how many variables. I forget how many 200 variables, and he wrote during his project he got a C program to run it down to 500 microseconds, and anyway it ultimately went to hardware and it was actually right in there at packet time. It was in the microsecond range. I forget what it was, but anyway, so these real-time things are actually quite interesting and fun. And I think actually are going to have a lot of impact. Okay. So let's look at an example. This one is from supply chain management. So this is, in fact, it's not from, sorry. Let me change that around. This example essentially is supply chain management because it's completely generic. So here's what it is. I have a bunch of nodes, and these are warehouses or buffers. It depends on if you're storing goods or storing packets or something like that, or fluid or whatever. This is going to be single. This is going to be single commodity. It's very easy to make this. Once you understand how to do this, totally trivial to make it multi-commodity. Then you have M links that go between the nodes of the warehouses. These could be actually communication links. They could be air freight or something like that. It doesn't matter. Pipes. Xi of t is going to be the amount of commodity at node I in period t. Uj is the amount of commodity transported along the link j. And then you describe we'll split the traditional graph node incidence matrix into its negative and positive parts, and we'll call those A in and A out. And this basically tells you whether link j enters or exits node 1. So I guess it's something like A in minus A out would be the traditional graph node incidence matrix. That's the one that's got the 1 and minus 1 on every edge. The 1 tells you what it points into, and the minus 1 tells you where it comes from, or the other way around, depending on which standard you use. So the dynamics is this. It's linear. It says that the amount you have at a certain time is equal to x of t plus, this is the amount that came in, and then minus that's the amount that flowed out. And let me just for fun ask a question. Suppose you had spoilage. In fact, suppose I told you that this is a perishable good, and at each step, 10% of the commodity goes bad. Please modify the equations. Yeah, thank you. Would it be linear then still? Yeah, sure. Okay. I'm just pointing out, there's a lot of stuff you could do. I guess you did that, right, in your thing? But your A's have someone. Spoilage in airplanes, that's not good. No, okay. All right. All right, so, okay, here are the constraints and objective, and these are just sort of generic. One is to say that the x is the amounts go between 0 and some x max. You may not have to have this x max. That would be a buffer limit or something like that. By the way, it's also very common in some cases to let x go negative, in which case it represents a backlog. So it's the same idea as having a negative investment in an asset. It means you have the obligation to produce it or something like that. So you can actually have a place. I mean, if a customer makes an order, you can actually take the order, and now you have a backlog, which is just says how many units do you have on stock. They could say negative 12. Means 12 are back ordered. I mean, you have to we're going to add a penalty for backlog if you do that. You have to add a steep penalty for backlog. But that's another version of this. Link capacities go between 0 and some maximum value. This constraint, this is a vector of the amount removed from each node or warehouse, and that's got to be less than x of t. Some people call this actually they call that a time, do you remember what they show on mine? I just saw some presentation where this had some name to people who do supply chain. It means that what you can't do is you can't ship 10 units to a warehouse and then ship it out on the same time period. Everybody know what I mean? So if you didn't have this, it would mean you could actually do it all. So I think of it like a digital circuit, like a two-phase clock or something like that. Basically on the rising edge, all the trucks leave, and this is that. This says the truck can't leave with stuff that's not there. And then on the falling edge of that clock, they all arrive. So that's my model of it. Okay, you can have a shipping transportation cost. That's S of U of t. This could be positive, negative. It can include sales revenue, manufacturing cost, all sorts of stuff in it. Warehousing and storage cost is just a charge on W. If you allow X's to go negative, you would have, in fact, a cost, a backorder charge, which could be real or just an internal accounting. And your objective would be to minimize this. I should mention one thing. There are some very common shipment and storage cost charges which are not convex, and that would be like a fixed charge. We're not going to look at those, although you could. They would be things like this. The cost to run a truck from here to there is fixed. So if you're going to put 2 little boxes in the truck, it's going to cost you the same as filling it. Okay? And so that would have a cost that would go up like that. And then actually then it would go like, then it would jump up again. These would be highly non-convex. Okay, obviously, every time you jump from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, trucks or something like that. So we're not going to look at those, although one could. So now we'll just look at an example. It's an example with 5 nodes, 9 links here. And everybody here, everybody has some amount of commodity at different nodes. They come out here. Presumably this is sold or something like that. So we'll get revenue from shipping stuff out on these 2 links. At each step, I can ship whatever I like along these edges. I mean, it has to be there for me to ship it somewhere. And I'll have a buffer limit of 1. The most I can ship is 0.05. My storage cost will look like this. It's linear plus a quadratic term. And the shipping cost will just be linear. I pay linearly to ship among warehouses. Now my shipping cost, I don't know if it's fair to call it shipping, but when I pull things out those bottom 2 nodes, I actually get paid for it. That's why this is negative. So that's revenue from delivering product here. The initial stock is 10011, and you just we'll run MPC with 5 steps or something like that. The optimal cost, by the way, is 68.2, and the MPC cost is 68.9. So once again, just 5 steps is enough planning horizon to actually do very well. And let's just see what this looks like here. So I think what was the here? It's 10011. So it's 1 0 0. Is this right? 1 1. Is that right? I think that's right. Okay. So So what I'll do, I guess, is I'll start shipping these out immediately. That's clear. But then I won't have much space here. So I'll probably ship some over to the middle and stuff like that because I'll run up a smaller. So I'll actually I'll spread the product around and then ship it. So actually the point is even baby examples like this, what to do? Not obvious, not remotely obvious. And you can imagine what would happen if you have 40 links and 50, it goes on and on. Okay, so here's the example. So the optimal was obtained just by solving a very long problem. And this just shows you a couple of things. I guess the first one shows you, this is x1, which starts at 1. And you can see stuff is shipped out, then held, and then it's shipped down until about 30. This is x3, goes from 0, it goes up, and then down again. Sorry, it's the same thing. There's the optimal and there's the MPC. They're not quite the same, but they're very close. And you can see here that these are the shipments made. So the optimal says that, for example, U3 should ship a bunch, then sort of stop, something like that. And then U4 should ship nothing, and then somewhere around 12 start shipping stuff out like that. And then this is the MPC one. You can see actually it's not the same. But it's close. It's good enough to give you within 2% the optimal cost. In fact, if the horizon were any longer, they would just be indistinguishable, the two. And by the way, just the pictures of these tell you this is not obvious. This is not remotely obvious how to do that. I mean, what to do here. And we should have. Maybe we'll make a movie. Did you make a movie? I can't remember.
Yeah, I did, but it's not.
Yeah. So you could make a movie or whatever that would show. I mean, presumably. You could make a movie or something that would kind of show you the right thing to do, where after several steps you'd spread your product all around, and then after one thing is done, stuff starts pumping out the bottom or something like that, and that minimizes your various costs. Okay, let me just mention a couple of variations on the optimal control problem. We've already said this. You can have time varying costs, dynamics, and constraints. One very extremely common thing, especially in finance, is discounted cost, where the cost in the future is actually discounted by a discount rate, like you divide by 1.05 to the t in the future. What's funny about that is the people who do control have discount costs with negative rate. They put higher cost on the future, which induces the control to be more aggressive to bring something to zero faster. So no one in control would ever use a discount cost, and everyone in finance would use a discount cost if the whole thing is going down over a long enough period. We've already seen this. You can have couple state input constraints. You can add slew rate constraints, and I'll just ask you one question, then we quit for today, and then that's our next topic. But let me ask you this. If I added constraints like ut plus 1 minus u of t is less than that, that's a slew rate constraint. It says that your input can't change by more than some amount. Tell me what that does to the problem structure. It what? It smooths out the solution, sure, because it says that you can't change very radically. But what does it do to the problem structure that you need to solve? It preserves locality in time. In other words, it's another constraint, but it affects only things close in time. That should go in your brain. The whole center of your brain that controls sparsity patterns and things like that should be lighting up like banded, 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 banded. And the other one should be going like fast, 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 fast. Okay, we'll quit for today.